with us Neil Dillon from ALMA, and Neil is research fellow at ALMA and leads the evaluation, accountability and learning work stream. His interests lie in improving evaluation systems to meet the evidence needs of all stakeholder groups as the humanitarian system evolves and adapts to change. He's currently running the pilot phase of the ALMA Guide on Evaluation of Protection in Humanitarian Action and overseeing a research project on monitoring humanitarian response. And before joining ALMA, he was an evaluation consultant in Belgium, where he conducted numerous evaluations with the European Commission, Director General for Humanitarian Aid and Development Cooperation. And he also holds a PhD from King's College London. So very impressive. So Neil, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Yes. The back, yeah, loud and clear, good. So first of all, I just wanted to thank the organisers for this, for the invitation to come, but also for organising this session in the first place. I'm going to look at this guide that we are pre-launching today. So the official launch will be in January in Dublin, but we're pre-launching it today. Yeah, lucky you. Yeah, exactly. But one of the things that happened when we were doing the piloting phase for this guide and some of the preparation work is that we were often bringing together protection specialists and evaluation experts. Thank you. And every time we did that, they said, wow, I never get to speak to this group of people. This is the first time I've really been confronted by them and their needs and their problems. And so it's quite heartening today to see that you've got this setup where you're looking at research and protection, and you're bringing together specialists from different areas to look at that. And so what I would really hope is that this is actually the start of something that will continue, because I think it's something that's needed. Good. So I'm going to walk through the guide before we officially launch it in Dublin. Forgive me if it's a bit boring. Actually, I ran through the presentation with my wife on the plane here, and she said it's good, but it's a bit boring. Which is great. Yeah, I know, really, really friendly. But her point was that what I'm doing is I'm presenting a guide, and I think it's true that what we should do is open the questions up a little bit and look at some of the challenges and the difficult issues that are being covered. So for that reason, don't be afraid to ignore the kind of section by section description I'm going to give, but actually ask me challenging questions. So I'm going to give you this overview of the guide itself. I want to give you a sense of what's in there, so I'm going to go through the key sections. But before I do that, I want to just introduce ALNAP and the evaluation work that we do so that you can understand how this guide fits into a larger context. And then I'm going to look at some of the reasons for why we're doing this guide, some of the rationale for it, before going through step by step. I'm a bit worried I've got the wrong slides here, by the way. This looks like the wrong version. But we'll see as we go on. And then going to go through step by step, looking at the stages of the guide, including initiating the decision, the evaluation.
It's the last one you said.
Yeah, okay, then it's my fault.
No, wait.
Okay,
It's
should we
this
just
one.
quickly check?
So this is the print.
Yeah, this is not the right version.
It's the one you sent to me only.
Okay.
Or not, okay.
Well,
Let me-
how about, given that we're starting a bit late, how about I walk you through roughly how this guide fits into the broader work that we do. So to give you the rough picture, ALNAP is a learning network, right? So we have 100 different agencies. We're not a think tank that produces thoughts. What we're doing is sharing learning between agencies. And for that reason, the evaluation workstream that we have is focused on a similar kind of approach to learning. So there's 3 different types of thing that we do in that workstream. One is producing research and guidance, the kind of stuff we're going to look at today. But the other is the kind of capacity building, ad hoc capacity building support, where we go out and help an agency who wants to develop its evaluation policy or framework and will respond to their needs. And in the other case, we're doing peer-to-peer learning, where evaluators will talk about the kinds of challenges that they have, whether they be evaluators themselves, the consultants that do it, internal staff doing evaluation, or evaluation commissioners. That looks like it could be. Let me check the next slide. There you go.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Another one,
So
okay.
we just stick that up.
Uh,
Perfect. That's it.
Okay.
Good. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So, as I was saying, 3 types of activity. And what we're going to look at now is the evaluation and protection guide, which fits into that research and guidance activity or class of activity that we do at the top. The reason why I'm telling you that is that this guide does not stand alone. In 2016, we launched an evaluation of humanitarian action guide. That's a guide that looks at all the evaluation challenges you have in the humanitarian sector. Its scope is to try and cover the full range of steps in an evaluation, and its audience is really to look at commissioners and evaluators and program staff. What happened when we did that evaluation is that lots of challenges, specific challenges, came up around protection and how an evaluator should approach it. And what we saw was that there was kind of a different level of problem. There were core problems to do with conceptualizing protection, what outcomes in protection look like, or if you can even talk about them, what good looks like in protection work, and how protection is related to other types of humanitarian aid, if you can even make that distinction in the first place. So the types of problems that we saw for protection for evaluators were just of a different nature than the types of problems that we saw elsewhere. So for that reason, we decided to split this and do a separate guide that's looking specifically at this issue. So what I'm going to do is walk through the steps of the guide, but before that, I'm going to give you a little introduction to why we kind of delved into it. Like I said, there was lots of issues that were sort of quite specific to protection, but it's also true that there's kind of a different framework going on. If you think of the work that Nora has done to get recognition of the centrality of protection in humanitarian action, that's a framework and an evolving policy framework that's actually quite live, right? So we had the 2013 statement from IASC on the centrality of protection. We had work on mainstreaming protection from 2012. We had the ICRC professional standards on protection from 2009 to this year. There are revisions happening right now. These are normative frameworks that are developing live, right? At the same time, what we didn't see is any particular guidance on how to do evaluation. So it seemed like we have an evolving policy framework, more people allegedly being aware and being sensitized to the importance of this work, but very little guidance on how to evaluate whether it's working or not. So that sort of seems like an obvious area where you'd want to do some guidance. But there's one more issue there. It's the fact that protection itself is a very difficult thing to evaluate. Across the UNAP membership, you have UN agencies and donors and NGOs, all of whom have different mandates and different interpretations and different relationships to protection. That means that you have very different and diverse program models for tackling protection risk. You also have lots of kind of data availability questions that are perhaps exacerbated in protection contexts. And you also have a very, very difficult challenge when it comes to understanding causation for protection outcomes. So these are all kind of technical problems that exist. So it kind of just reiterates to us that it was weird that there isn't any serious guidance out there. And in the preparation for this guide, we did a kind of a lit review where we looked at the lack of consistency in evaluation approaches to protection. And some of the, in fact, Nora, I know you've spoken with some people who've faced this problem, but we've certainly seen a lack of clear, visible, open targeting and kind of consideration of the protection challenge across the board when it comes to doing evaluation. So those are the reasons why we thought it important to delve into this. So once we kind of built the rationale, we've put together the guide. If you want to know what's in it, it's essentially covering those three areas that I mentioned earlier: initiation, data management, and analysis questions. I'm going to go through these step by step in the presentation, so we don't need to worry about that now. But it's worth mentioning that this is a guide that follows the pattern of guidance that we provide. So it's got sort of features that are supposed to help people dive in and dive out of it. And that's quite important. I think it's just worth mentioning, because the trouble with doing guidance, especially when you are a network of so many people, is that no one really has one approach to doing this. As a result, you need to be able to dip in and dip out. You need to be able to look as a commissioner on some of the issues on doing your terms of reference. And if you're a consultant, then you might have to look at some of the data collection challenges. So in all of our guidance, we tried to do content maps to make it easier to facilitate that. We also emphasize sharing and learning the evaluators' insights. So that's why it would be really interesting to hear from any of you here who do evaluations, whether you have particular insights that we could perhaps add into this guide as we go on, because it's reasonably live. And the last thing that's in there is there's a list of toolkits. So there are 6 different toolkits for use. They are not a list of, it's not a checklist. It's not like you're supposed to use every single one of these. They're tools that you can potentially use. They cover a range of different things, from designing the rubrics and the questions, doing the evaluability assessment in the first place, looking at tools and approaches, and then some kind of techie stuff about influence and interest matrices, contribution analysis, causation, stuff like that. So these are supposed to be tools that evaluators can lean on if they find it particularly useful. Good, right. I think that's the boring stuff over, in my opinion. If we delve into the stuff on initiating the evaluation, the first thing that we're going to look at is evaluability conditions. I'll move on to some of the other stuff on criteria and logics and tools later, but evaluability is something that's quite important. Does everybody here, do they feel familiar with the concept of evaluability? Is that something I should open up? Okay. Well, just as a reminder, I mean, why should you do an evaluability assessment in the first place? At ALNAP, we're aware that there's lots of different things that you can do to learn about a program. You don't just have to do an evaluation. There's quite a wide spectrum, and our guide on how to do evaluation of humanitarian action outlines that spectrum. You could go from an after-action review or a formative evaluation or a real-time evaluation to an ex-post summative evaluation or an evaluation synthesis. There's lots of kind of things, even within that evaluation bracket, that you need to sort of navigate, you need to select on a rational basis. So the first reason why you want to be doing an evaluability assessment is you want to make a decision about whether an evaluation is appropriate or not, and if so, what type. The second reason is you want to identify some of the issues that are going to be there that are going to confront you when you start doing the evaluation. They're going to cover all sorts of things like the overall ambition of the piece, the types of questions you want to ask, the questions about the program design, the thing that you're evaluating, questions about the availability of the data and the conduciveness of the context. There's lots of stuff that you always have to worry about when you're doing an evaluation. If you're interested in doing it on a good basis, you need to think about this stuff. But when it comes to doing protection or considering the extent to which protection is an issue to look at in the evaluation, there are specific questions that we think at ALNAP you should be asking. So when you're looking at things like the types of question, for example, the overall ambition, protection raises all sorts of questions about the role of external actors, which I think we covered briefly this morning. I imagine you discussed it yesterday as well. Just understanding the scoping of an evaluation and understanding whether your questions are about things that the program has direct control over or things that the program has very, very indirect sort of sphere of influence type of control over. It's important when you're designing your evaluation questions that you appreciate that. I'm not saying you should only ask questions about one or the other, but you should appreciate exactly what types of questions you're asking and how appropriate they are to that context. When you're looking at program design, you have to ask yourself questions about whether the intended results are clear, because often in some of the programming documents that evaluators have seen when they're looking at protection, you'll see that protection is kind of thrown in at the last minute. It's just hastily added because there's a feeling that we need to talk about that, but without a really clear understanding of what results you really want to see, for who, and why. And so that's an issue that needs to be particularly looked at when it comes to evaluability in this context. Then there's things like data, like do you have disaggregation of data? I think that was mentioned earlier. Do you have a full understanding of your data by gender, ethnic or group affiliation, sex, age, things like that. And conduciveness of the context. I mean, protection contexts are ones in which you very often have security constraints to worry about and ethical constraints, particularly for data collection and management. So the point is, we think there are very specific questions that you need to ask about protection when you're deciding whether or not to do an evaluation. And the guide outlines that in much more detail than I can give you right here. So I'd be interested to hear, especially if evaluators or people that have been involved in commissioning, if there are any here, have confronted with regards to deciding whether or not an evaluation is appropriate. Right, next point is on the criteria. Again, I'm assuming everyone knows the OECD DAC criteria for evaluation. Is that fair? Broadly speaking, it's a set of criteria by which we can evaluate overseas aid, whether it be development or humanitarian. It has specific amendments and developments in the case of humanitarian contexts, but we're looking at things like the relevance, effectiveness and efficiency of a program. At ALNAP, I would say that we, broadly speaking, support the use and advocate the use of the DAC criteria, but we advocate them as a tool for thinking, not as an excuse to avoid thinking. And sadly, I think we do see a lot of tick box stuff where people say, look, we have to ask a question about each of the criteria, and we're not going to think about how it applies to the program. So really, I think the core message from the Evaluation of Humanitarian Action Guide in 2016 is to identify what you need to know with this evaluation and then place it within the criteria, not the other way around. Right? So you're using the criteria to make you to reflect and to ask yourself additional questions and make sure maybe there are things that you missed when you first thought about this and how you should better structure the evaluation framework. So that's the kind of general guidance we give. But in the case of protection, I think there are some specific questions we need to ask ourselves about some of the criteria that OEC DAC recommend that we use. There's more to it than this, but just for the sake of this presentation, I'll look at those three. On coverage and sufficiency, I think the first point is to admit that very often protection needs are poorly addressed. Perhaps that's because there's not enough money. Perhaps it's because they're very hard to define. Perhaps it's because they're hard to measure. Perhaps it's because they're even harder to tackle. We don't know. But the point is that there is a core coverage and sufficiency question that needs to be asked as an evaluator. Did this program really properly plan and budget for looking at protection needs or not? Or is it something that's just kind of tacked on as an additional extra? I think that's critical mainly because of the centrality of protection and the realization in the community that that's something that we need to take seriously. So as an evaluator, you really need to check, is this taken seriously? So there's an issue there on coverage that's specific to protection. There's also an issue on connectedness. So in all programs, we want to look at how the program is connected to other actors in the field, other types of issues. In the case of protection, I think we need to admit that protection is essentially about the misuse and abuse of power across communities, societies, households. That's quite a difficult thing to map. In any context, that's a very difficult thing to understand. So evaluators, when they're looking in disaster context, need to be prepared to map that complexity and to consider the interaction of the program with other actors. It's not something you only do if the program has particular protection considerations, but it's something you should definitely be doing if you are looking at a protection-oriented program. And the last point is on impact. So I think that coming back to that point about complexity, we need to accept that understanding the causal connection between, let's say, advocacy, a protection advocacy activity, and a decision by a host government to open a border or respect non-refoulement or something like that, is quite difficult to make an attribution challenge, because it's very hard to identify whether the program itself was the thing that caused the change or not. Again, it's something that's true in lots of cases, but in protection, because of the nature of the outcomes we're talking about, we think it's systematically difficult, and therefore we need to be open to using quite nuanced analyses for causation. So those are the kind of three things. When we're looking at the criteria, we definitely think that coverage, connectedness, and impact we need to tread quite carefully on. And in the guide, we break that down in more detail, and we look at the impacts on other criteria as well. We all, apart from Antonio, are we all asleep? All awake? Yeah, good. good. So the next point is on the intervention logic. So here we mean, what's the program logic? What are they trying to achieve? What are the activities, and how are they related to their intended results? As an ex-evaluator, I can understand how frustrating programmers find it when you turn up and say, what's your theory of change? And you ask them to sort of fill in a box and state their assumptions and all that kind of stuff. I do find it frustrating, but sometimes I also find it to be quite useful in terms of teasing out some of the hidden assumptions behind the program. And in the case of protection, I think we have that twofold, because there's, as I mentioned before, there's kind of a variety of approaches to protection. So that means we can have a variety of different program models. We can have standalone, I'm just looking at protection, that's what I'm doing, that's what I got funded for type of programs. Or we can have integrated programs where we have a WASH program where we're actually got some activities that are on protection. Or we can be serious about mainstreaming and think that all the work that we do needs to have protection elements to it, and you can't even define an activity independently of protection. There's three very different ways to approach those problems. And as an evaluator, you really need to make sure that you're clear and that the people you're talking to are clear about what model they've taken. Because if you end up asking someone who thinks he doesn't have to worry about protection about, I don't know, what was the impact of your WASH program on creating harm or something like that, you're going to be confronting some problems. So you need to be, as an evaluator, very clear about what kind of model you're talking about. And the next point is to look at the context. So as I said before, external actors and factors, they play a massive role in protection outcomes. So it's important to make space for that in the context, right? So when we were preparing this guide, we spoke to a lot of evaluators who tried to do evaluations the standard way and just look at the program logic and then just try and find out if the results were achieved, and found that they were missing the most important things. So when we piloted this guide, we did it with DRC in Turkey. And it was very interesting. The evaluator ended up drawing up a very different theory of change that really focused on how the program interacted with larger dynamics, government dynamics essentially, and larger funding programs outside of that program, that project itself. So his learning from that was that in the case of protection, that stuff on context is twice as important as it normally is. So that has implications really for the type of analytical tools that you can use. But we'll get onto that in a minute. But just when you're looking at understanding the project itself, it's very important to make space for that stuff, and understanding some of the social network analysis stuff is particularly important. And then lastly, considering unintended consequences. So protection is complex. I think I think Nora might disagree with me, but I think it's quite a complex thing to try and target. If you're looking to try and reduce risk across physical, legal, economic spaces, that's quite a complicated thing. You're going to have quite hard to predict causal pathways. You might find that single actions have large outcomes and multiple actions have a very small outcome. That's not normal, right? That's not how you do standard programming. So you're looking at tipping points and quite strange causal chains. As a result, we have to be humble, and we have to admit that maybe when the program was designed, we weren't fully aware of what all the effects would be. So we need to have, as an evaluator, a questioning approach that means that we can track unintended consequences, that we're asking affected persons exactly what happened rather than checking a box to say, did this thing happen, right? We're rather just finding out what changed. So that openness to unintended consequences is particularly important. Good. On tools, which is essentially the last thing to worry about before getting on with the evaluation stuff. Again, this is an issue that we face across the board in evaluation, but there are some specific issues for protection. I've drawn up just a couple of the key methodological challenges that we saw when we were drafting this, when we were piloting it. We saw these things as coming out as particularly challenging for evaluation methods. There are more, and the guide lists them, and there are probably more that we've missed. But just for the moment, I'm going to look at this stuff, which I've kind of briefly discussed. Let's start with the top. I mean, the nested program activities, we often see, and maybe we don't want to see this, but we do often see organizations having a large program which attempts to do lots of different things, and then at the bottom of that list you have some protection activities. And so that's kind of nesting your protection work within a larger program. That's quite difficult as an evaluator, because you have to be able to approach people who aren't necessarily considering protection and ask them protection questions. So you need to be quite savvy about the way that you do that. Then there's things like spillover effects. So if we're talking about a program that's taking place in Turkey, and then all of a sudden the government changes a large policy framework, that can have a very, very big impact on the program itself. And so understanding the different kind of dynamics and the lines and modalities of the protection work, that's something that's very difficult to do. So you need to have a questioning framework that is open to that kind of stuff. And then the same applies for the complexity of the causal pathways. We need to be happy handling complexity. And so we need to kind of shy away from tools that just look at very, very narrow, straightforward causal chains. Those are the kinds of challenges we face, and I think the point is that there are both program implications and evaluation implications. And one of the things that came up during the piloting phase was that the biggest program implication of this, which I think is yet to be fully worked out, is that agencies are starting to look at the importance of continuous protection risk analysis. So it's very interesting in your example that you had context analysis as step 1, protection risk analysis as step 2, and then monitoring as step 3. And when you said that, I thought, whoa, that sounds like you're not going to continue doing a protection risk analysis. In fact, it's not true, right? The nature of your monitoring is, in fact, to continue that risk analysis as you go. But I think it's fair to say that not everyone is there yet, right? And this is something that people need to, well, I think we'll see more and more organizations taking that up. As that happens, evaluators need to ask how effectively are organizations like your own doing that. And that's quite tricky because it's quite a new thing that's being done, and so we don't really know exactly what good looks like in that area. But there are normative frameworks. The new ICRC standards talk about continuous protection risk analysis. Interaction has done some work on this as well. They're looking at some of the complexity stuff as well. So I think evaluators need to be asking questions about how an organization is stacking up against those kinds of frameworks. Then there's also, just final points there, there's additional points that come directly from these challenges for evaluators. So like I was saying, you need to have tools and questions and interview strategies that are open to unintended consequences. And they need to be happy sitting alongside a program. If you're doing a continuous risk analysis, you might change your programming halfway through implementation. So you need to have an evaluation approach that can handle that, right? So things like developmental evaluation, the Michael Quinn pattern stuff, outcome harvesting. These are tools that help you track that kind of stuff. So I think it's just important that evaluators are kind of familiar with those when they're entering into the protection space. Good. Okay, so enough of planning. The next two things I want to cover, I'll cover slightly more briefly. The first is on data management. And the truth is this is it's just an infinitely more complicated thing than I have space for here. And the guide, it was actually probably the largest section of work that we did, was on understanding some of the ethical and legal risks that are posed to evaluators when they're operating in this space. But for the purposes of a short presentation, I'm just going to look at conflict sensitivity and analytical risks. So on conflict sensitivity, I'm going to be asking about how evaluation tools affect the situation on the ground, affect affected people, right? And then on analytical risks, I'm going to be going the other way. To what degree do protection specificities affect the quality and the usability, eventually, of the evaluation itself? So they're two different directions of concern. So looking at conflict sensitivity, I think there's questions about the way that people conceive their ethical and legal responsibilities in conflict environments in particular. I think for program staff, there's a lot more that's going on. I think for evaluators, it's safer to say that you need to make sure, at least, that you cover do no harm, right? It's because you're not providing assistance to anybody. So the task is slightly simpler. What you're doing is you're going in and you're assessing how something is working, which will hopefully improve the product later on, but you're not actually providing assistance. As a result, what you need to be really sure of is that you don't create any harms when you're in that space. So for that reason, we did stick to, broadly speaking, the do no harm considerations. They're fairly standard. They don't stick specifically to protection, but there are, again, specific considerations here. So things like creating false expectations. We saw examples of projects, evaluation projects, where people were interviewed in quite difficult situations of conflict, and they had they were very vulnerable people, and by participating in the evaluation, they came to believe that they and their household and their community group would become recipients of aid. And of course that turned out not to be true, because in order to participate in an evaluation, you need to make sure it's not tied to the provision of aid. But that can then create massive frustrations. And in the context that we're talking about, in conflict context where you're talking about very vulnerable people, that frustration is actually a harm in and of itself. So that's something that we think we need to be very careful about. The second point is on exposing the views of the vulnerable. Again, when we're talking about protection dynamics where we have powerful duty bearers and often very vulnerable groups, it's very important to make sure that the views of vulnerable groups being exposed does not create an additional vulnerability to reprisal, right? So that's just a very important thing that we need to make sure we consider. And that you can see also in things like tools like focus group discussions, where you can exacerbate tensions by bringing people together into one room who might stand on either side of a conflict dynamic, or indeed by separating people, because sometimes we've seen examples. There was a good example in DRC where that exacerbated community tension because people were treated entirely separately during the evaluation data collection. And then lastly, I would just say that findings themselves. So sometimes published evaluations can become sort of a battleground for opinion. And if the findings in the evaluation are not thought through, for example, by including a predominance of the views of the powerful stakeholders, that can actually lead to increased marginalization of vulnerable groups. So it becomes important to understand that kind of thing and how the evaluation itself can impact on the conflict dynamic. So as a result, we think it's very important that conflict-sensitive approaches are taken. We're talking here about assessing evaluation activities very, very early on, doing that against a kind of a stakeholder and a conflict mapping, and then revising the approach as you go through. So being prepared to change your evaluation tools when you're in the field, in the middle of doing something, because you can see that there's a tension arising. And that's a degree of flexibility that I think sometimes people aren't expecting to have to implement. Good. So then the last point on data management is on analytical risks. So here we're talking about just key issues. There are some answers in the guide, but the truth is that part of the rationale for doing the guide is that we don't think there's been enough serious evaluation work in this area. So I don't think we've really got answers to these problems yet. But the purpose of the guide was really to say to evaluators, you need to think about this stuff when you're doing this type of evaluation. So the first thing you need to worry about is the data environments. If you're talking about rapidly changing environments or large displacements across borders or even within borders, baseline data, if you even have access to it, if you even have access to it, it quickly becomes irrelevant. And so there just needs to be an understanding of that fact. And likewise an understanding that conflict can polarize views, and therefore the importance of triangulation of findings becomes doubly so. And then lastly, restricted ranges of tools. So as I mentioned before, some tools can actually be ruled out on the basis that they might do harm. And sadly, the response to all of this stuff about poor data environments is that you want to add to your range of data collection tools. Well, I'm sorry you can't, because very often some of them can actually make things worse. And very often, evaluators struggle to get access to the affected persons in these types of situations. So you're kind of caught between the two, really. And I think what we're doing is we're asking evaluators to take this stuff seriously and then see what, maybe in the next 5 years, they can come up with as sensible solutions. Good. Lastly, I think I'm on time, I'm going to look at the analysis section. So here we're looking at how evaluators go back to the intervention logic and revisit it, and then also how they understand cause and effect. These are standard things for evaluators to do, but there are some specific issues we think they should consider here. First point on the intervention logic, I would say it's a generalization, but when we're talking about hastily constructed programs, and we're talking about acute crises in particular, we often see kind of a lack of or an absence of explicit assumptions about protection risks. The reasons for that I think are complicated, and I think Nora's probably much better positioned to tell me why that's the case. But I do think that when we consulted evaluators for this guide, we saw that there was consistently a lack of explicitness about the protection risk and the assumptions underneath that. So this is something that evaluators need to revisit and budget for and plan for and build buy-in for amongst the key stakeholders to the evaluation right at the beginning. Then there's the point about the influence of institutional worldviews. So again, whilst it would be, I think, better if this wasn't a problem, that's not the world that we live in. And unfortunately, whilst protection risk analysis should be thoroughly objective, as we saw earlier, often you can see institutional dynamics at play. Different institutions have different mandates, and that can affect the nature of the risk analysis. So the evaluator should be able to come along and should have the independence to come along and ask not just, are you doing things right, but are you doing the right thing, right? Have you really analysed the full breadth of protection risk without bias or restraint? And I guess the last 2 points are fairly simple in the sense that complexity is simple. I've mentioned it before, so I won't spend long on it, but really we need to be quite comfortable as evaluators when it comes to analysis, that we understand that the different types of projects and activities that are undertaken in the name of protection can often blur the lines between who's responsible for what. And as a result, that can lead to different influences on the prioritization of activities. So evaluators, again, need to be able to confront that. They need to be given the space to confront that and ask questions about how that project-level complexity is worked through in implementation. And I'll see there's something there on perceptions. I don't think we've done enough on this in the guide, and I don't think there is enough good work on it. But the truth is, I think there's a feeling, certainly amongst evaluators, that protection results or outcomes involve stuff that's many things that are hidden. So things like the sense of safety, that's quite hard to define or to measure. I don't think we should be at a place where we reduce discussion about protection to someone's sense of safety or security. But I do think we need to be in a place where evaluators are comfortable taking into account the hidden dimensions of protection. And that's something that's quite difficult, that evaluators typically shy away from, but we think that we should be looking at it again. So for that reason, the guide has a lot of questions that we want evaluators to ask themselves when they're in the analytical stage at the end of an evaluation, when they're synthesizing their findings. And we think it's important that that's trialed and tested quite thoroughly. Lastly, cause and effect. Generally speaking, the general attribution problem. Can we really establish that it was the project that caused the results. Was it really the butler that murdered the victim? Who knows? Always a problem in evaluation. In protection, I mean, it's just doubly so. And I think it's good to see the ICRC recognizing that, just being open about the fact that it's very rare that single activities can really reduce risk. And so I think evaluators just need to be very careful about that when they're looking at causation claims, as they often do. I don't think there's a single answer to that. The ALNAP guide is really recommending that evaluators approach that issue, don't shy away from it, but approach it with caution, and do so in a context where you can take account of the multiplicity of external actors that are going to be predominant in any causal analysis. Contribution analysis is just one way of tackling that. So this is the kind of Michael Bamberger style approach, where instead of making a clear attribution claim, what you try to do is understand, did the project or program or activity contribute to a change? The guide itself includes, as one of the toolkits, a sort of outline of the standard approach to doing contribution analysis. It's summarized here. To summarize the summary, essentially you're looking at starting with the theory, going out to look for evidence, right? Can you really see evidence that this was in line with results that were happening on the ground? But then doing this reflexive stuff, and that's kind of the key for contribution analysis. You need to ask yourself whether there could have been other things that caused the effects in question, and then going out and asking for more evidence as a result of that. So it's that kind of iterative reflexive process that's really at the heart of contribution analysis. And it's something that we think that evaluators need to be very serious about when they're doing protection work. Good. So that's the boring presentation over. The next steps for this, I'd like feedback from all of you, particularly those of you who have done evaluations or who commission them. I would like to know if you think there are any areas or any gaps that we haven't covered in the guide. It is available online on the ALNAP website, so please do take a look. The next steps then are going to be the launch in Dublin in January. We'll be doing some work with Interaction as well, who are doing some further research and some follow-up. So hopefully we can continue that in good faith and with good results. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And don't hesitate to get in touch with me if you want to feedback any comments on the guide. Thanks.